The horse came in lame. That was the first thing Ethan Crow noticed when he rode into Iron Hollow just after nightfall. The way his mare had started favoring her left foreleg somewhere around the ridge, a subtle hitch in her gait that told him she'd pushed herself past what was fair. He'd pushed her. He knew it. He just hadn't cared enough to stop. He swung down from the saddle in front of the livery and stood there a moment, one hand resting on the horse's neck while he let his eyes adjust to the dark. Iron Hollow wasn't much to look at. A single main street maybe 300 yards long, a scattering of buildings that looked like they'd been assembled by men who weren't entirely sure what they were doing, a saloon with a crooked sign, a general store with a busted window patched over with oilcloth, a jail that had clearly seen better decades, the kind of place that existed because it was convenient to something else, a mining claim somewhere up in the hills maybe, or a crossroads between towns that actually mattered. Ethan had ridden through 100 towns like this one. He couldn't remember most of them. "You going to stand there all night, or are you going to put that animal inside?" The voice came from inside the livery. A man in his late 50s with a lantern in one hand and a look on his face that suggested he'd been about to close up and resented the interruption. He had the thick forearms of someone who'd worked with horses his whole life, and the kind of squint that came from spending too many years watching men ride in and out of places looking like trouble. "She's favoring her left front," Ethan said. "I need her looked at." "I can see that from here." The liveryman set his lantern on a post hook and came forward, crouching to run his hand down the mare's leg with the practiced ease of someone who actually knew what he was doing. "You ride her hard today?" "Yes." "From where?" "Far enough." The liveryman looked up at him. Not unfriendly, exactly, but not warm either. Just a man taking the measure of another man doing the arithmetic. Ethan let him look. He was used to being looked at. He was a tall, lean figure in a dark coat that had seen too much weather, with dark hair gone gray at the temples, and a jaw that hadn't met a razor in 3 or 4 days. The holster on his hip was worn smooth from use. The rifle on his saddle was newer. "She'll be fine," the liveryman said finally, standing. "Soft tissue. Day's rest, maybe 2. I'll wrap it." "I only need 1 night." "You'll get what she needs, not what you need." The old man took the reins without asking permission and led the mare toward a stall. $1.50 for the night, feed included. Ethan paid without argument. He pulled his saddlebag and rifle and walked out into the street, standing there in the dark and the cold for a moment while he figured out what he needed. A drink. A meal, if there was anything edible. The name of whoever was acting as sheriff in this backwater, because his business here was the kind that required at least a conversation with law enforcement before he conducted it. The saloon was the obvious answer to all 3. It was called the Copper Nail, which was either someone's idea of a joke or a name that had once meant something and now didn't. Inside it was warm and low-ceilinged and smelled like wood smoke and unwashed men and something frying in the kitchen that might have been pork. A card game was happening in the back corner with the careful silence of men who were concentrating. 2 cowboys were arguing at the bar about something that seemed to involve a fence line and someone's cousin. A woman in a red dress was playing a guitar badly and seemed unbothered by this fact. Ethan found a table near the wall and sat with his back to it. The barkeep sent over a girl with a bottle of whiskey and a glass, and Ethan poured himself a measure and looked at it for a while before he drank it. The whiskey was rough, the kind that burned going down and kept burning for a while after, like a small punishment. And he poured a second before the first one had finished settling. He was 41 years old. He'd spent the last 16 of those years doing essentially the same job, finding people who didn't want to be found and bringing them back to people who had the legal authority to deal with them. He was good at it. He was maybe the best in the territory at it, depending on who you asked, though he'd never been the type to argue the point. The work paid well enough that he didn't have to think too hard about what he was going to do next. The work kept him moving, which meant he was never anywhere long enough for anything to catch up to him. That was not an accident. He was on his 3rd whiskey when he caught the first edge of the sound. A commotion from outside, half a block down the street. Someone shouting. He would have ignored it except the voice was female and it had a quality of desperation in it that wasn't the kind that came from a domestic argument or a dispute over wages. It had the quality of someone who had run out of normal options and was on the ragged outer edge of panic. He sat there for another 10 seconds. Then he stood up, left a coin on the table, and walked outside. "What?" She was arguing with the doctor. That was apparent from 20 feet away. A woman in her late 20s standing on the steps of a building with a small wooden sign reading, Dr. Henry Cole, physician. Her hands moving with the kind of emphatic desperation that people use when they're afraid that words alone aren't going to be enough. The man she was arguing with was short and gray-haired and had the careful, bureaucratic manner of someone who had learned to put distance between himself and people's suffering because the alternative was drowning in it. "I have told you, Miss Bennett," the doctor was saying, with the patience of a man who had said this several times already. "The cost of the treatment is $14. I cannot extend further credit. I've already extended more than—" "He's 9 years old," the woman said. "He is 9 years old, and he has a fever of 103, and the treatment you're talking about is just quinine and camphor and the cost of the components." "I know what the cost is." Her voice dropped suddenly, and somehow that was worse than the shouting. "Dr. Cole, I'm asking you, not for charity. I'll pay it back, every cent. I'll teach extra sessions through the summer. Miss Bennett," the doctor's voice had gone flat. "I'm sorry about your brother. I genuinely am. But I have a family of my own, and I cannot run a practice on promises." He went inside and closed the door. She stood there for a moment with her back to Ethan, perfectly still, and then she put one hand against the door frame and pressed her forehead against it in the way that people do when they've run out of visible options and are trying not to fall apart in public. Her shoulders were rigid. Her whole body was rigid, actually, with the effort of holding itself together. Ethan stood in the street and watched this. He had learned over 16 years to keep the appropriate professional distance between himself and the situations he wandered into. He dealt in logistics. A person had committed a crime, a price had been set. Ethan's job was to handle the gap between those two facts. He did not get involved in things that weren't his business. He did not lend money to strangers or get into arguments with doctors or spend emotional currency he didn't have to spare. He told himself all of this while his boots were already carrying him toward the steps. "How much do you need?" She turned around fast, not startled exactly, but wary, the way people in hard circumstances learn to be wary of strangers who appear offering things. She had a face that would have been pretty if it weren't so tired, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair coming loose from its pins, and a smear of something on her sleeve that might have been medicine or might have been something worse. She looked at him the way she'd look at any large man appearing out of the dark, offering to give her money. I don't want—" She stopped, tried again. "Who are you?" "Doesn't matter. How much?" $14. She said it like she hated saying it, like the number had a particular kind of shame attached to it that $14 shouldn't logically carry. Ethan reached into his coat and counted out $14 from the money he carried for expenses and held it out to her. She looked at it for a long moment without taking it. "I don't know you," she said carefully. "No. I can't just— Why would you—" "Because the doctor is being an idiot, and you need the money," Ethan said. "I'm not going to be here long enough for it to matter, so you can pay it back or not. Take it or leave it." She stared at him for another 3 seconds that felt longer than that. Then she took the money. Her hand was shaking slightly, and she gripped the coins like she was afraid they might disappear. "Thank you," she said, and there was something raw in the way she said it. Not the polished gratitude of someone performing thankfulness, but the kind that came from somewhere real. "I'm Clara Bennett." "Crow," he said. "Go get your medicine." He turned and walked back toward the saloon. The man Ethan had come to Iron Hollow for was named Del Rucker, and by the next morning, Ethan had a reasonably complete picture of where to find him. Rucker was wanted in 3 counties for armed robbery, and the reward was $40, which wasn't exceptional but was enough to make the ride worthwhile. He was staying, according to the barkeep Ethan had been carefully friendly with the night before, at a boarding house on the eastern edge of town called Mrs. Holt's, because he was apparently the kind of outlaw who valued a clean bed and home-cooked meals even while actively evading capture. Ethan found him at breakfast. This was the part of the job that no one who romanticized bounty hunting ever thought about. Most of the time, the actual apprehension was undramatic. Rucker was a heavy-set man in his 40s who'd made the mistake of getting comfortable, and he was 3 bites into his eggs when Ethan sat down across from him and laid his badge on the table, an authorization from the territory marshal that gave him the legal standing to make arrests. "Del Rucker," Ethan said. Rucker looked at the badge, looked at Ethan, looked at his eggs. He had the defeated posture of a man who had been running long enough that part of him was almost relieved to stop. You going to let me finish breakfast? He asked. I'll let you finish the eggs, Ethan said. Not the coffee. We've got a ride ahead. They had the coffee anyway, in the end, because it seemed unnecessarily cruel not to, and by mid-morning Ethan had Rucker in irons and was trying to figure out the logistics of the next 12 hours. His mare wasn't ready to travel. The liveryman had been clear about that. He needed to send word to the county seat about Rucker. He needed somewhere to keep Rucker secure in the meantime. The acting sheriff of Iron Hollow turned out to be a nervous young man named Walt Pickett, who was about 24 years old and deeply grateful that someone who knew what they were doing had shown up to handle this, because Walt had apparently been aware of Rucker's presence for a week and had been hoping the problem would solve itself. I can keep him in the jail tonight, Walt offered, with the enthusiasm of a man who was glad to be useful without being required to be dangerous. You can ride out tomorrow when your horse is ready. Appreciate it, Ethan said. With that handled, he found himself unexpectedly at loose ends, a condition he didn't particularly like. He had nowhere to be for the rest of the day and most of the next morning, and Iron Hollow was not a town that offered many ways to occupy time productively. He ate a meal at the only eating establishment that wasn't the saloon, a small place run by a woman named Ida, who made the best cornbread he'd had in years and seemed vaguely offended when he said so, as if the compliment was an observation too obvious to merit comment. It was early afternoon when he passed the schoolhouse. He wasn't looking for it. It was simply there, on the south end of the main street, a low building with a bell above the door that wasn't much but was clearly kept up. The steps swept, the windows clean, a small kitchen garden along one side that someone tended carefully. He could hear a voice inside, calm and precise, working through a lesson. He slowed his pace without quite meaning to. And if John has 7 apples and gives 3 to Mary, how many does John have left? A chorus of small voices attempting to calculate this. Take your time, Clara Bennett said inside. The answer isn't going anywhere. Ethan kept walking. He found out about Noah that evening, not from Clara but from Ida at the eating house, who had the conversational habit of providing context whether or not you'd asked for it. Noah Bennett was 9 years old, Clara's younger brother by 12 years, and had been in Clara's care for the past 4 years since their mother had died of pneumonia, and their father had disappeared into the kind of story that ended badly and quietly. Clara had come to Iron Hollow to take the school teacher position and had brought Noah with her, and they lived together in the 2 rooms behind the schoolhouse that the town provided as part of her salary. Noah had been sick for 3 weeks, with something that the doctor called a fever of uncertain origin, and that the rest of the town called bad luck. He had gotten worse before he'd gotten better, and then he'd gotten better before he'd gotten worse again, and the last round of medication, the medication that Ethan's $14 had purchased, seemed to be helping, but slowly, and there was still genuine uncertainty about how this ended. She doesn't sleep, Ida said, refilling Ethan's coffee without asking. I can tell by looking at her. She comes in here some mornings before school, looking like she hasn't closed her eyes, and I don't say anything because what's there to say? That's what love does to a person, ties you to someone so that their suffering is your suffering and there's nothing to be done about it. Ethan looked at his coffee. You know her? He asked. We all know each other here. That's what a small town is. Ida leaned on the counter. She's a good woman. Too serious, maybe. She doesn't let people help her the way she should. Stubborn about it, actually. A pause. You're the man who gave her the money last night. Word travels. Always does. You didn't have to do that. I know. Why did you? Ethan picked up his coffee. The doctor was being an idiot. Ida smiled at that, small and knowing. Is that all? That's all, Ethan said, and drank his coffee. Zeb. He didn't go looking for Clara. He told himself this firmly and repeatedly over the course of the next 24 hours while his mare healed and Del Rucker sat in Walt Pickett's jail and Iron Hollow went about its small, ordinary business around him. He had no business going to look for Clara Bennett. She was a school teacher with a sick brother and a situation that was nothing to do with him. He'd given her $14 on an impulse that he wasn't entirely sure he understood, and that was the beginning and the end of it. He was sitting in front of the livery the next morning, waiting for his mare to be declared fit, when Clara appeared. She came around the corner with the brisk, purposeful stride of someone who had many things to do and limited time to do them, carrying a basket over one arm and a look of focused determination that suggested she was in the middle of a mental list. She almost walked past without seeing him. Then she stopped. They looked at each other. "How is he?" Ethan asked, because it was the only question that seemed relevant. Something shifted in her face. Relief, or the careful guarding of relief, as if she wasn't quite ready to trust it. "Better," she said. "The fever broke last night. He drank some broth this morning and complained about the taste of it, which—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "He hasn't complained about anything in 2 weeks. I didn't realize how much I missed it." "That's good," Ethan said. "Yes." She shifted the basket to her other arm. "I don't know how to thank you properly." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I want to." She paused. "Will you—" "I'm making supper tonight. Nothing much, just whatever I can put together. But if you haven't made other arrangements, you'd be welcome to eat with us." Ethan looked at her. The sensible answer was no. The sensible answer was that his mare would be ready by midday, and he'd be riding out with Rucker before evening, and this whole town would be behind him by nightfall. The sensible answer was that he did not eat supper with school teachers and their sick brothers. That was not the kind of man he was, or the kind of life he lived, and pretending otherwise for an evening wasn't doing anyone any favors. "I'll be there," he said. Well, the 2 rooms behind the schoolhouse were small but scrupulously clean, with the particular kind of order that people maintain when they don't have much, and what they have matters. There was a table with 3 chairs, a bookshelf with more books than Ethan would have expected, and a narrow cot near the window where Noah lay propped up on pillows, wrapped in a quilt that had been patched so many times it had become its own kind of document. Noah himself was a small, slight boy with the kind of coloring that showed illness clearly, still pale and hollow-eyed, but with a brightness coming back into his eyes that hadn't been there before. He studied Ethan with the frank, unabashed curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend he isn't looking. "You're big," Noah said. "Noah," Clara said from the stove, not turning around. "He is, though." "Yes, and stating it loudly as the first thing you say is rude." "I don't mind," Ethan said. He pulled out a chair and sat down, which at least reduced the height differential. "You must be Noah." "Must be," the boy agreed in a tone that suggested he found this self-evident but was willing to be polite about it. "Clara says you paid for my medicine." "Clara talks too much. She says that too, about herself." Noah shifted in his cot to see him better. His eyes were the same dark shade as his sister's, but where Clara's had learned to guard things, Noah's still showed everything. "Are you staying?" "Just passing through." "Everyone's just passing through," Noah said, with the world-weary tone of a 9-year-old who had heard this phrase before. "That's what they all say, and then half of them stay anyway." "Noah!" Clara set a pot on the table and finally turned around, and her expression was the complicated one of a person who is simultaneously embarrassed by something and privately amused by it. "Eat your broth and stop interrogating the man." "I'm not interrogating, I'm having a conversation." The distinction is subtle. The meal was simple. A stew that was mostly vegetables with some salt pork for flavor, cornbread that wasn't as good as Ida's but was solid, and strong coffee that Clara poured with the focused attention of someone for whom coffee was a genuine comfort rather than a habit. She moved around the small space with the efficiency of a person who had long since made peace with its limitations, not apologizing for what she didn't have. Ethan had eaten in grand houses and in the dirt, in saloons and jailhouses, and occasionally from a saddlebag, while riding at a pace that made eating inadvisable. He had not eaten like this. At a small table with a checkered cloth and a sick child nearby, and a woman who kept glancing at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. In a very long time, maybe ever. The warmth of it was almost uncomfortable. "Where are you headed?" Clara asked, at some point in the middle of the meal. "County seat. I'm transporting a prisoner." "Is that what you do? Transport prisoners?" "Among other things." She looked at him for a moment. "What else?" "Find them first," Ethan said. "Usually that's the harder part." "And before that? Before you found people for money?" The question was asked carefully, with the precision of someone who was genuinely curious, but also aware that they might be asking about something that had edges. He appreciated that. Most people either avoided the question entirely or asked it with a prurient bluntness that he found tedious. "I was a soldier," he said, "before. And after the war, for a few years, I tried other things." He paused. "None of them took." "What kind of other things?" "Farming. Didn't have the patience for it. Worked in a freight office for a while. Didn't have the patience for that either." He picked up his coffee. "I'm better at moving than staying." Clara was quiet for a moment, in a way that suggested she was thinking rather than just waiting for him to stop talking. "Is that a preference or a habit?" It was a surprisingly good question. He turned it over for a moment. "I'm not sure I know the difference anymore," he said honestly. From the cot by the window, Noah made a sound that might have been a comment or might have been him shifting into a more comfortable position. "Clara says habits are just preferences you stopped noticing," he said helpfully. "Go to sleep, Noah," Clara said. "I'm not tired." "You have a fever." "Not anymore." "You had one 3 days ago." "Sleep." Noah pulled the quilt up to his chin with the air of someone registering a formal protest while complying with the directive. Within 10 minutes he was asleep, with the absolute completeness of the very young and the very ill, and the room became quieter in a way that was different from the absence of his voice. Something settled. Ethan should have left then. He knew it. His mare would be ready in the morning, and Rucker was waiting in the jail, and there was no logical reason to be sitting in a small room behind a schoolhouse at 8 o'clock in the evening, making conversation with a school teacher he'd known for less than 48 hours. Instead, he sat there while Clara cleared the table, and they talked. Not about anything important at first. About the town. She'd been here 2 years and had formed opinions about nearly everything with the clarity of someone who observed things for a living. About the students she taught, 12 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she described each of them with a specificity that suggested she'd thought hard about who they were and what they needed. About books, because the shelf was impossible to ignore, and it turned out she had views about literature that she expressed without any of the hedging people sometimes used when they were worried about seeming too certain. Ethan didn't talk about himself. He rarely did, but he listened. And Clara had a way of talking that made listening feel like participation rather than passivity. She'd ask him things and wait for the answer in a way that suggested she actually cared what it was. "Do you ever want to stop?" she asked at some point. "Moving. Do you ever want to just stay somewhere?" He looked at the table. "Sometimes. But wanting something and knowing what to do with it are different things." He glanced at the sleeping boy. "You know what that's like." Her expression shifted. "Yes," she said quietly. "I do." The candle between them was burning low, and the fire had settled to coals, and outside the window, Iron Hollow had gone to sleep in the way that small towns do. Completely, all at once, like a decision rather than a gradual fading. "I should go," Ethan said. Clara walked him to the door. He stepped out into the cold dark, and the air hit him after the warmth of the room, and he stood there for a moment while she stood in the doorway with the candlelight behind her. "Thank you," she said. "For supper, I mean. For staying." "Thank you for the meal," he said. He walked back toward the livery and the room he'd rented above it, and he did not let himself look back because he knew that if he did, he'd see her still standing in the doorway, and something about that image was already more difficult to carry than he was prepared to deal with. He was leaving tomorrow. He was always leaving. That was the whole point. He climbed the stairs to his room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark and listened to the wind coming down off the mountains, and the thing he thought about, without meaning to, and more than once, was not Del Rucker or the county seat or where he was headed next. He thought about a small room lit by a low candle, and a boy asleep under a patched quilt, and a woman who asked questions like she expected real answers. He thought about what it would feel like to have somewhere to come back to. The wind picked up outside. Somewhere down the street, a shutter banged loose, and someone went to fix it with the muffled efficiency of a person who'd dealt with that particular problem before. The town settled back into silence. Ethan lay down on the bed with his boots still on and stared at the ceiling and waited for morning, which eventually, like everything, arrived. He left Iron Hollow the next morning. That part happened exactly as planned. He rose before the sun was fully up, paid the liveryman the remaining balance on his mare's care, collected Del Rucker from Walt Pickett's jail with the minimum of ceremony, and rode out of town heading east before most of the town had finished breakfast. Rucker rode with his hands cuffed to the saddle horn and complained about it intermittently in the tone of a man who knew complaining wasn't going to accomplish anything, but felt obligated to register the discomfort anyway. The ride to the county seat took 2 days. Ethan collected his $40, signed the necessary paperwork, shook hands with a deputy marshal who smelled like tobacco and seemed grateful for one less thing on his list, and stood outside the county building in the flat morning light with $40 in his pocket and absolutely nothing pulling him in any particular direction. This was the part of the work that people didn't think about when they thought about bounty hunting. The moment after. The job finished and the next one not yet begun, and the strange hollow feeling that lived in the space between them, not exactly loneliness, because loneliness implied a wanting that he'd trained himself out of. More like the absence of purpose, a man-shaped space where a reason to be somewhere was supposed to go. He stood there for 10 minutes. Then he rode back west. He told himself it was because there was another job in that direction, and that was true, in a technical sense. He'd heard in the county seat about a warrant outstanding for a man named Cord Bellamy, operating somewhere in the hill country north of Iron Hollow, wanted for extortion and assault with the suggestion of worse things pending investigation. The reward was $60. It made logical sense to pursue it, and the territory north of Iron Hollow was as reasonable a place to start as any. He told himself this and kept riding and did not examine the telling too closely. Iron Hollow looked the same when he rode back in 4 days after he'd left it, which made sense because 4 days wasn't long enough for a town to change. The same crooked sign on the copper nail. The same patched window on the general store. The same school bell above the schoolhouse door that he found his eyes going to before he'd consciously decided to look. He took a room at this boarding house this time, Mrs. Holt's, where Del Rucker had made his ill-fated last stand against convenience, because the livery loft was drafty and his back had been complaining about it since approximately the second night. Mrs. Holt was a woman in her 60s with a direct manner and a house rule about mud on the floors that she communicated through a single look at his boots when he arrived that required no verbal reinforcement. He was settling his mare into the livery when Clara found him. She came around the corner with the same purposeful stride he'd noticed the first time, but she stopped when she saw him, and her expression went through 3 or 4 things in fast succession. Surprise. Something that might have been relief. Something more guarded that arrived after the relief, as if checking its work. "You came back," she said. "Working a job up in the hills," Ethan said. He kept his voice level and his attention on the saddle he was unsecuring. "Bellamy. You heard the name?" "Everyone's heard it." Her voice had changed slightly. "He and his men came through 2 weeks ago, rode through the south end of town and shot out 2 windows and told the people inside that they were going to start collecting a tax on any business operating within 20 miles. Ethan set the saddle on the rail and turned to look at her. "Anyone hurt?" "Not then. There was an incident at the Harper farm last week. They roughed up the older son pretty badly when he wouldn't give them access to the grain stores." She paused. "Walt rode out there, but there wasn't much he could do. There were 8 of them." "How old is Walt Pickett?" 24. "Right." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "Is there a circuit judge who comes through here?" "Every 3 months. He's due in about 6 weeks." 6 weeks was a long time for a town to live under that kind of pressure. He knew how it went. Men like Bellamy started with property and escalated to people, and they escalated faster when they felt unopposed. 6 weeks of feeling unopposed was a long runway. "How's your brother?" he asked. The guard in Clara's expression eased, just slightly. "Good. Really good. He's back in school. I made him wait another 3 days than he wanted to, which caused a significant amount of negotiation." A small smile crossed her face, brief and genuine. "He asked about you." "Did he?" "Several times. He wanted to know where you'd gone and when you were coming back, and I told him I didn't know either thing, and he seemed to think that was an unsatisfactory answer." "Smart kid. Inconveniently so, yes." She looked at him steadily. "I'm glad you're back. For the town's sake," she added. "With Bellamy and everything." "Of course," Ethan said. They both looked at something other than each other for a moment. "If you need information about Bellamy's movements," Clara said, "you should talk to Marcus Webb. He runs the freight operation on the North Road, and he has people moving through the hill country regularly. He'll know more than Walt does about where Bellamy camps. I'll find him. He's at the freight yard mornings and the saloon after 4. A pause. He's cantankerous but honest. Good combination, Ethan said. She nodded once, briskly, in the manner of someone concluding a conversation that had perhaps become slightly more complicated than intended, and walked back out into the street. Ethan watched her go, then looked at his mare, who gave no opinion on the matter. Marcus Webb was indeed cantankerous. He was also, as Clara had predicted, honest, and he had the particular value of being a man who paid attention to things, not out of nosiness, but out of the professional habit of someone whose livelihood depended on knowing what was happening on the roads his freight traveled. "Bellamy's got a camp somewhere up near the Garnet Creek Fork," Webb said, without looking up from the manifest he was working through when Ethan found him at the freight yard. 3, maybe 4 days north of here, depending on the route. He's got 12 men now, not 8. He picked up some riders about 2 weeks ago from the looks of it. He flipped a page. They're extorting at least 6 operations that I know of. Mines, farms, 1 logging outfit. Taking supplies and cash and implying that the alternative is considerably less pleasant. Has anyone reported it formally to the marshal's office? One of the miners did. Marshal's office sent word back that they'd look into it when resources allowed. Webb said this with the flat effect of a man conveying information he found contemptible. Resources haven't allowed yet. Ethan sat with that for a moment. 12 men and a camp in the hill country, and a circuit judge 6 weeks out, and a local law enforcement apparatus consisting primarily of Walt Pickett, who was earnest but 24. The math was not great. "Anyone in town who can ride and shoot?" Ethan asked. Webb finally looked up at him. "A few." "Why?" "Because going into those hills alone to collect 1 man out of 12 is possible but ugly. If there's someone who can ride with me and keep the others occupied while I handle Bellamy directly, the odds improve." "You're asking me to help you recruit a posse." "I'm asking if there are men in this town who are tired of paying Bellamy's tax." Webb put down his pen, looked at Ethan with the assessing eyes of someone who had been doing business in hard country long enough to know the difference between genuine competence and its imitation. Whatever he found in Ethan's face seemed to satisfy something. "Come back tomorrow," Webb said. "I'll have some names." Noah was at the schoolhouse window when Ethan passed the next morning, and he knocked on the glass with 1 knuckle and waved with the unselfconscious enthusiasm of a child who had not yet developed complicated feelings about demonstrating that he was glad to see people. Ethan raised a hand in return and kept walking, but he was smiling before he'd quite decided to, and that was its own kind of answer to a question he hadn't asked. The work of the next 2 weeks settled into a shape he hadn't expected. During the days he was out in the hill country with Webb's recruited riders, 4 men, all of them experienced and none of them young, with the steady, unhurried competence of people who'd been living in hard country long enough that hardship was simply weather. Mapping Bellamy's operation, tracking his patterns, learning the geography of his camp. At night he came back to Iron Hollow and ate supper at Ida's or at Mrs. Holt's table, and 3 times he ate at the schoolhouse with Clara and Noah, and each time it was a little less strange and a little more like something else that he didn't have precise words for. Noah had recovered with the complete physical thoroughness of the young, the way children bounce back from illness in a manner that makes adults deeply envious. He was thin still, with the slightly fragile look of someone whose body had been through something, but his energy was returning in waves, and his curiosity was, as Clara had intimated, fairly relentless. "What does a bounty hunter actually do?" he asked one evening, in the middle of supper, as if the question had been in his head for a while and had finally grown too large to continue containing. "Noah," Clara started. "It's a fair question," Ethan said. He thought about how to answer it in terms that were accurate without being graphic for a 9-year-old's supper table. "Someone does something wrong. Does enough wrong that the law sets a price on bringing them in. I find them and bring them in." "How do you find them?" "Depends on the person. People have habits. They go where they know people, where they've been before, where they feel safe. You learn to think about where a particular person would go, and then you go there first." Noah considered this with the grave intellectual seriousness he brought to most things. "What if they run?" "Then you run faster." "What if there's more than one of them?" "You try to be smarter." What if you can't be smarter? Noah, Clara said more firmly. Then sometimes it goes badly, Ethan said. He met the boy's eyes directly, because Noah was the kind of child who noticed when adults talked around things and it annoyed him. That's why you try to be smarter. Noah nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. Do you always catch them? Almost always. What happened the times you didn't? Noah. Claire's voice had the particular quality of someone putting down her foot. That's enough. Noah looked at his sister, made the internal calculation, and returned to his plate. But a moment later, quietly, just to Ethan. I bet you caught them later. Sometimes, Ethan said. Clara was looking at him across the table with an expression that was partly exasperation with her brother and partly something else. Appreciation, maybe, for the way he'd answered. Or just attention. She had a way of looking at him that was different from the way most people did. Most people looked at Ethan and saw the coat and the holster and the general configuration of a man who was not to be trifled with, and they looked away again quickly, or they made too much of it in the other direction, trying to seem unimpressed. Clara looked at him like she was actually trying to see what was there. It was unsettling in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. He was asking because he worries, she said later when Noah was in bed and the two of them were sitting with coffee at the table. Her voice was lower than it had been during supper. About the people She stopped. He doesn't talk about it directly. But he knows the kind of work you do involves danger, and he's... Another stop. He's attached, Ethan said. Yes. She wrapped both hands around her mug. He gets attached. He always has. And most of the time, the people he attaches to... She didn't finish that sentence either. Leave, Ethan said. She looked at him. Yes. The fire had burned down to low coals. Outside the window, the first suggestion of autumn was in the air. A crispness that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. A cold edge that came down off the mountains at night. I'm here to do a job, Ethan said carefully. When the job's done, I know, Claire said. And the way she said it, not hurt, not accusing, just a quiet acknowledgement of a fact she'd already figured out, made it worse somehow than if she'd been angry. I'm not asking you to be anything you're not. I'm telling you about Noah because you should know, so you can... She paused. Manage his expectations. What about your expectations? Ethan asked. She looked at him steadily across the table. Mine are managed. He didn't know exactly what that meant. He thought he did, but he wasn't certain enough to say so, and so he said nothing. And after a moment, she stood up and began clearing the cups with the matter-of-fact efficiency that had started to feel, to him, like a form of self-protection. He walked back to Mrs. Holt's in the dark and stood on the porch for a while before going inside, looking at the mountains against the sky. The trouble with Bellamy clarified about 10 days into Ethan's surveillance, which was when one of Webb's men came back from a scouting run with news that made the timeline considerably more urgent. Bellamy was planning to move on Iron Hollow directly, not in the incremental way he'd been operating. The ride-through, the broken windows, the implied threat. Something more organized. One of the miners who'd been paying his tax had apparently stopped paying, and Bellamy had decided that Iron Hollow was going to serve as an object lesson in the consequences of non-compliance. He was bringing his full outfit down from the hills within the week. Ethan heard this from Webb in the freight yard on a Tuesday afternoon, standing in the thin autumn sunlight with the feeling of a clock starting somewhere that hadn't been running before. How sure are you? He asked. The miner who told me has been paying Bellamy since June, Webb said. He's scared and he's not the type to invent things. Ethan turned this over. A full outfit, 12 men, riding into a town with a 24-year-old sheriff and no military presence. Even if Webb's 4 riders were willing and able, which he believed they were, the numbers were bad. The key was Bellamy himself. Take Bellamy out of the equation. Arrested, neutralized, with the warrant served and a legal record started. And the outfit would likely dissolve, because this kind of operation depended on the man at the center. Hired guns didn't tend to hold together without someone directing the enterprise. I need to move sooner than I planned, Ethan said. How much sooner? 3 days. Before they ride down. Webb was quiet for a moment. Going into that camp with 5 men against 12. Sick, said a voice behind him. He turned around. Clara was standing at the freight yard gate, her arms crossed against the cold, with an expression that suggested she'd heard more of the conversation than either of them had intended. "Clara," Ethan said, "don't Clara me like that. I'm not applying to ride with you into the hills. I'm not stupid." She came forward. "But I grew up in rough country before I came here, and I know how to handle a rifle. And if you're planning to create a distraction at the camp while you go in for Bellamy, an extra gun at the perimeter matters." "Absolutely not," Ethan said. "I'm not asking—" "Clara." His voice was flat. "No." She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that communicated that she was registering the decision and filing it under a category she was going to return to later. "Then what can I actually do?" she said. "Not nothing. I'm not going to sit in the schoolhouse and wait to find out what happened." Ethan thought about it. "Can you get the families on the south end of town, the ones closest to the road from the hills, into the schoolhouse by Thursday morning, without causing a panic?" She considered, "I can tell them we're having an early harvest gathering. People will accept that." "Good. Do that. Keep them there until you hear from me or from Webb." "And Noah?" "He'll be in the schoolhouse with you." Something moved across her face at that, something that wasn't quite relief but was adjacent to it. The acknowledgement that someone was thinking about what she needed without her having to ask. She covered it quickly, but he saw it. "All right," she said. The operation went into the hills 2 days later, before dawn, with 5 men and a plan that Ethan had walked them through 3 times, and that was simple enough to survive contact with reality, which was the best thing a plan could be. The basic shape of it: 2 of Webb's riders to the east approach, 2 to the west, creating the impression of a larger force and giving Bellamy's men something to respond to. Ethan to the camp directly, coming in from the north down a dry creek bed that his surveying suggested would be unguarded because it was a difficult approach, and Bellamy's people had gotten comfortable. Difficult approaches were Ethan's area. He went down the creek bed in the dark on his hands and knees for the last 100 yards, because the noise of a man moving upright was different from the noise of a man moving low, and Bellamy's camp would have someone listening. The camp was a cluster of lean-tos and a fire that had burned down to coals, with horses picketed on the east side and 8 or 9 sleeping figures and 2 men on watch who were watching in the wrong direction because the distraction from Webb's riders had drawn their attention by the time Ethan came out of the creek bed. Bellamy was not hard to find. He was the man in the largest lean-to with the cleanest bedroll, because men like Bellamy, in Ethan's experience, tended to arrange for their own comfort as a way of demonstrating status. What followed was not clean or quick or particularly elegant. It rarely was. There was a moment when Bellamy woke up and went for the pistol under his blanket, and Ethan hit him once, hard, with the butt of his rifle before he could reach it. And then there was a great deal of shouting from outside as Webb's riders made their presence known, and 2 of Bellamy's men ran, and 3 more came toward the lean-to and stopped when they saw Ethan had their employer in irons and a rifle trained on the general vicinity. Men like Bellamy hired men who were pragmatic about which fights were worth having. The pragmatics of this one were fairly clear. By the time the sun was fully up, Bellamy was secured and 3 of his men had been disarmed, and the rest had made the decision to be somewhere else. Ethan had a cut on his forearm from a knife he hadn't seen coming that was going to need stitching, and one of Webb's riders had a bruised rib from a horse that had gotten spooked and kicked backward. And everyone was tired in the particular way that comes from operating on adrenaline for 4 hours and then having it drain away. They came back into Iron Hollow in the late morning with Bellamy and irons on a lead rope, and the town came out to look in the manner of people who had been living under a shadow and were now watching it lift. Walt Pickett met them at the jail with the expression of a man who was deeply relieved and was trying to look like he'd had this handled all along. "I'll hold him for the circuit judge," he said. 6 weeks, like we talked. "He'll need guarding," Ethan said. "Real guarding. His men scattered, but some of them might try to recover him before the judge gets here." Walt straightened. "I can handle it." Ethan looked at him and decided to believe this. "I know you can," he said. He left his horse with the livery man and walked to Dr. Cole's office to get his arm stitched, which the doctor did with efficient disapproval and the opinion that it would have been a cleaner cut if Ethan had moved faster. Ethan refrained from pointing out that he was the one who'd been in an unlit tent at 4 in the morning, and perhaps cleanliness of result was relative. He was sitting outside the doctor's office with his arm newly bandaged and his coat over his lap when he heard running footsteps on the boardwalk, And then Noah hit him at approximately the speed and force of a small cannonball, wrapping both arms around him with the complete physical unself-consciousness of a child who had decided that some things needed to be communicated through proximity. Ethan sat very still for a moment. He could not remember the last time someone had simply grabbed onto him like that, like he was something worth holding on to. "Noah?" Clara said from 5 feet back in a voice that was trying to be a reprimand and not quite getting there. "He's fine," Ethan said. He put one careful hand on the back of Noah's head. The boy smelled like chalk dust and something medicinal, the lingering ghost of his illness, and he held on with the single-minded grip of someone who has identified the relevant thing and is not letting go. "Are you hurt?" Noah demanded, into Ethan's coat. "Little bit," Ethan said. "I'm fine." "Is he in jail?" "He is." Noah nodded against his chest, apparently satisfied, and loosened his grip but didn't let go entirely. Clara was standing a few feet away, watching this with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and her face had the look of someone who had been holding something at a careful distance and was finding, against their better judgment, that the distance was closing. "Thank you," she said. Not the way she'd said it the first night, with the raw gratitude of someone in crisis. Something quieter, something that was about more than the word. "I'm just," Ethan started. "Just doing the job," Clara said. "I know." But neither of them quite believed that anymore, and they both knew it. Mans. Ethan's arm healed over the following 10 days, during which he stayed in Iron Hollow with the understanding that he was waiting to give testimony when the circuit judge eventually arrived, which was true as far as it went. Webb paid him for his part of the operation from a collection the businesses in town had taken up, which was more than he'd expected and slightly awkward to accept, because taking money from a town he was helping had a different feeling than collecting a warrant reward. He helped Walt Pickett organize a proper rotation of guards for Bellamy's jail cell. He fixed a fence at the Harper farm that had needed fixing since before the trouble started, because he happened to be riding past and had the tools and the time. He ate supper with Clara and Noah 4 more times, and each time it was less remarkable that he was there, and that itself was the most remarkable part. He was teaching Noah to play cards one evening, a simplified version of poker with matchsticks as stakes, because Clara had put her foot down about actual money, when he looked up and found Clara watching them from across the room with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't happy, exactly. It was more like the face of someone who was looking at something they'd wanted and wasn't sure what to do with the wanting. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just looking." Noah looked up from his cards. "She does that when she's thinking hard about something," he informed Ethan. "She thinks you don't notice, but you do." Noah... "It's useful information," Noah said, returning to his cards. Clara put her hands over her face briefly, which was the response of a person who found their immediate family simultaneously infuriating and completely impossible to be angry at. Ethan looked at his matchstick pile and thought, not for the first time, that leaving was going to be more complicated than arriving had been. That was new. He was always very good at leaving. He had a feeling, sitting there in the warmth of that small room with the matchsticks and the cards and the boy who had grabbed onto him like he was worth holding, that whatever version of himself had been good at leaving was going to have a serious argument with the version that was sitting here. He had a feeling the argument was already starting. Outside, the autumn wind came down off the mountains in the dark, cold and steady, and Iron Hollow held on against it the way small towns do, imperfectly, stubbornly, together. The argument started on a Wednesday. That was the part Ethan would remember later. Not the content of it, not the exact words, but the day. Wednesday. The sky had been doing something complicated all morning, heavy clouds building behind the mountains and then pulling back as if reconsidering, and the air had the particular electric quality of weather that hadn't yet decided what it was going to be. He had been in Iron Hollow for 5 weeks. He knew this because he'd been counting, in the way that a man counts things when he's trying to maintain some relationship with a self-imposed deadline, and the deadline keeps becoming less convincing. The circuit judge was due in 6 days. Once Bellamy was formally processed and Ethan's testimony recorded and the legal machinery set in motion, there was no remaining professional reason for him to stay. That was the fact he'd been holding on to. The judge's arrival as a fixed point around which everything else would organize itself and resolve. He just hadn't worked out yet what it would resolve into. Clara had noticed his restlessness. She noticed most things, which was simultaneously one of the things he respected most about her, and one of the things that made the current situation genuinely complicated. She hadn't said anything directly, because that wasn't how she operated. She was too careful for that, too practiced at not making claims on things she wasn't sure she had a right to. But he could feel it in the way conversations had started ending slightly before they would have ended a week ago, a kind of preemptive pulling back that she probably wasn't fully aware of. Noah, characteristically, had no such indirectness about it. "Are you leaving when the judge comes?" he asked on that Wednesday, while Ethan was splitting firewood behind the schoolhouse, something he'd started doing 3 weeks ago when he'd noticed the pile was getting low and Clara hadn't mentioned it, which meant she'd been planning to do it herself after school. "Probably," Ethan said. Noah sat on the chopping block he wasn't currently using and watched him work. The boy had a gift for the kind of silence that wasn't really silence, the kind that was waiting for something. "Where would you go?" Noah asked after a reasonable interval. "Depends on what work there is." "But you don't know yet." "No." Another interval. Noah picked up a wood chip and turned it over in his fingers. "Clara doesn't say things," he said, "but she looks different when you're here. She looks less—" He seemed to be searching for the word. "Tired," he settled on. "She looks less tired." Ethan set down the axe. He looked at this boy, 9 years old, thin still, with the clear eyes of someone who saw things and reported them faithfully without fully understanding their weight. "Noah," he said. I know it's not my business," Noah said, without any particular defensiveness. "I'm just telling you what I see." He slid off the chopping block and went back inside, leaving Ethan standing there in the cold with a pile of split wood and the feeling that he'd just been handed something he had no idea what to do with. The argument with Clara happened that evening. It wasn't really about what it was ostensibly about, which was whether she'd eaten anything since morning. Ethan had come by to return a book she'd lent him the previous week, and found her still at her desk at 6:30, grading papers in the failing light with a cold cup of tea at her elbow, and the look of someone who had been too busy to notice she was running on nothing. "Have you eaten?" he asked. "I'll eat when I'm done." "When's that?" "When I'm done." He sat down in the nearest chair, which was one of the children's chairs, and therefore approximately the right size for a 10-year-old, and waited. Clara kept grading with the deliberate focus of someone who was declining to acknowledge that there was another person in the room choosing to occupy furniture that didn't fit him. After 5 minutes, she put her pen down. "What?" she said. "Nothing," Ethan said. "I'll wait." "You don't need to wait." "I know." She looked at him. He looked at her. This was, he'd learned, the essential structure of most of their actual disagreements. Not shouting, nothing dramatic, just two people with strong ideas about how things should go who were each quietly declining to move. "Ethan?" Her voice had shifted, quieter. "You don't have to do this." "Do what?" "Any of it. The firewood. Showing up to make sure I've eaten. Walking Noah home from wherever he's wandered to." She turned back to her papers, not looking at him. "You don't have to be responsible for us." "I know I don't." "Then why?" "Because I want to," he said. "Clara, I'm not doing it because I feel obligated." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was careful in the way that voices get when they're trying to contain something. "That's what I'm concerned about," she said. He waited. "You've been here 6 weeks," she said, "and it's been—" She stopped, started again. "I've watched Noah follow you around and talk to you about things he doesn't talk to me about, probably because I'm his sister and you're not. And I've watched you fix things and help people and eat supper at my table, and I've—" Another stop. "I've let it become something I shouldn't have." "Why not?" She looked at him then, directly, and her expression was the controlled face of a woman who had learned to be careful about the things she allowed herself to want, because wanting them had costs she'd already paid before. "Because the judge comes in 6 days," she said, "and you'll testify and file your paperwork, and then there won't be a professional reason to be here. And you told me yourself. You're better at moving than staying. I believed you. I still believe you." A pause. "I just should have remembered it sooner." Ethan sat in the small chair in the failing light and looked at her and tried to find the thing he wanted to say, the thing that was both honest and adequate. that neither promised too much nor dismissed what was actually happening. "I don't know what comes after the judge," he said finally. "I won't pretend I do. I know. But I want you to know that what happens here doesn't mean nothing to me. Noah doesn't mean nothing to me. You don't mean nothing to me." She looked at him steadily. "Meaning something isn't the same as staying." "No," he said. "It's not." The silence lasted a while after that. Not a comfortable silence, not an uncomfortable one. The silence of two people who have gotten somewhere true and are sitting with it. "Go home, Ethan," she said eventually, not unkindly. "I'll finish and eat something and go to bed, and I don't need watching over." "I know you don't," he said. He left. He walked back to Mrs. Holt's in the cold dark and lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling and thought, with the slow and inconvenient clarity that comes from honesty, that Clara Bennett was exactly right about most of what she'd said, and that he had no idea what to do about that. 3 days before the circuit judge arrived, everything went wrong. He was at Webb's freight yard in the afternoon when Walt Pickett came running, not the controlled trot of a man delivering routine information, but the actual running of someone carrying news that couldn't wait. Ethan was on his feet before Walt had covered half the distance, reading the shape of the emergency from the way the young sheriff moved. "It's Noah," Walt said, getting there, hands on his knees. "Clara sent me. The boy collapsed at school about an hour ago." Ethan was already moving. Clara was at the schoolhouse with Dr. Cole when Ethan arrived. The other students had been sent home, and the building was quiet in the particular way of places that are usually full of noise when they aren't. Noah was on the small cot that Clara kept in the back room for students who fell ill during the day, and he looked terrible. Worse, Ethan thought, than he had during the first illness, which might have been the comparison or might have been the reality. Clara looked up when Ethan came in. Her face was controlled, but her eyes were not. "What happened?" Ethan asked. "He was fine this morning," she said. "He was perfectly fine. He ate breakfast and came to school, and then at 2 o'clock he was just—" She stopped, pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. "He couldn't stand up." Dr. Cole was finishing his examination with the deliberate manner of a man organizing information before delivering it. He straightened, and Ethan watched Clara watch him, and he could see her bracing. "It's a relapse," Cole said. "The original infection wasn't fully cleared. This can happen. The treatment we used was effective, but the underlying—" He paused. "This is a more serious presentation than the first episode." "What does that mean?" Clara asked. The doctor's expression shifted into the particular configuration of a man choosing his words with care. "It means the quinine isn't going to be sufficient this time. The infection has progressed, and I've seen this pattern before, and when it presents this way—" He stopped. "There's a treatment. It's more aggressive and more effective. Dr. Harlan Price in Mercy Falls has been using it, a combination he developed himself, clinical trials in the Eastern hospitals, very good results in cases like this one. Then we need to send for it," Clara said immediately. Cole hesitated, and that hesitation carried a weight that Ethan felt before the doctor explained it. "Mercy Falls is a 4-day ride, each way, in the best conditions." The silence in the room was immediate and very complete. 8 days, Clara said. "If the weather holds, the mountain passes this time of year." Cole looked uncomfortable. "I have to be honest with you, Miss Bennett. Without the treatment, I cannot—" He stopped again, started more carefully. "I don't know that we have 8 days. Clara turned away from both of them. She stood facing the wall for a long moment with her arms wrapped around herself, not crying, not making any sound at all. Just the rigid, terrible stillness of a person absorbing something that their body didn't want to let in. Ethan watched her. "How many days do we have?" he asked Cole quietly. The doctor looked at him. Something in Ethan's face must have communicated that he wanted an honest answer and not a careful one, because Cole gave it to him. 5 days, he said. 6 if he responds well to the supportive care I can provide here. But the fever is going to climb, and if it climbs past a certain point— Where exactly in Mercy Falls do I find Price? Cole blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Dr. Price. Mercy Falls, where?" "He has a clinic on the main street near the livery, but—" Cole seemed to be recalculating. "You can't ride to Mercy Falls and back in 5 days, not through the mountains. The passes have—" "Not if I take the main road," Ethan said. He'd ridden through this territory long enough to know its geography, the way some men knew the floor plan of their own houses. The main road to Mercy Falls curved south around the worst of the mountains and added a day and a half to the journey. But there was another route. He'd used it once, coming east from a job 2 years ago, a mountain track that went directly north through the Sentinel Pass and cut the distance significantly. I can do it in 3 days going, possibly less. Cole stared at him. The Sentinel track in November. I know what the Sentinel track in November is. There have been early snows in the higher elevations. If you hit that pass in a storm, I'm aware of the risks, Ethan said. His voice was flat and steady in the way it got when he'd made a decision, and the making of it had settled something. Can you write me a letter for Price? Explaining the case, what he'll need to prepare? Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly. Yes, I can do that. Ethan turned. Clara had turned back from the wall and was looking at him, and her expression was something he'd never seen on her before. Stripped of all the careful management, all the practiced containment, raw in the way that only very particular kinds of fear can make a person. Ethan, she said. I'll need to leave within the hour, he said. The light's going, and I want to make the foothills before dark. You can't... She stopped. She knew he realized that telling him he couldn't do something was about the least useful thing she could do. She knew him well enough by now to know that. The Sentinel track, she said instead, her voice low. How bad is it? He thought about giving her a reassuring answer and decided against it, because she would know it was reassuring and it would frighten her more, not less. It's manageable, he said, if the weather holds. And if it doesn't, then I'll handle that when I get to it. She looked at him for a long moment. There were things moving behind her eyes that he couldn't entirely read, and he thought if he had more time he might stand there and try, but he didn't have more time. Don't die, she said. It came out rough, nothing like the composed way she usually spoke, and she seemed slightly startled by her own bluntness. Not planning to, Ethan said. He went to say goodbye to Noah. The boy was awake, which was both better and worse than if he'd been sleeping. He was awake and feverish and small in the cot, with the look of someone whose body was working against them and who was trying not to let the effort show. Clara said you're going somewhere, Noah said. His voice was thinner than usual, slightly hoarse. Mercy Falls, there's a doctor there who has medicine that'll help you. Noah looked at him. That's really far. It is. Is it because of me? Yes, Ethan said. He didn't see any reason to dress it up. Noah was quiet for a moment. The fever had put a flush in his cheeks that would have looked healthy if Ethan hadn't known what was causing it. You don't have to, Noah said. I know. You could just... Noah stopped. I know Clara would tell you not to go if it was dangerous. She wouldn't want you to. She already told me about the dangerous part, Ethan said. I'm going anyway. The boy looked at him with those dark eyes that missed nothing. Because you want to? He asked. The echo of the earlier conversation was deliberate, Ethan thought. Noah was 9, but he tracked things. Because I want to, Ethan said. Noah reached out and took his hand, briefly, in the uncomplicated grip of a child who has decided that this is the appropriate gesture for this moment and is not going to be self-conscious about it. Then he let go and settled back into his pillow. Be careful, he said, with the gravity of someone issuing an instruction they expected to be taken seriously. I will, Ethan said. He kept that promise in his chest as he went to saddle his mare. He left Iron Hollow with an hour of daylight remaining, with Cole's letter in his saddlebag and provisions for 4 days and the kind of focused emptiness in his mind that came over him before difficult stretches of work. Not calm, exactly, but the absence of everything except what was immediately necessary. The foothills took the first 3 hours. His mare moved well in the early dark, following the track by memory and instinct in the way that good horses do. And Ethan let her set the pace up the gradual incline rather than pushing, because he needed her sound for the pass, and the pace now didn't matter as much as the pace tomorrow. He camped at the base of the first serious elevation, not because he was tired, but because pressing the pass in full dark was unnecessary risk. He made a fire, small and efficient, ate what he'd brought, and slept for 4 hours with one hand near his rifle in the habit of years. He was moving again before the sky had lightened. The track up through the Sentinel was, as advertised, not good. It had been a route once, old enough that no one fully remembered who'd made it or why, But it hadn't been maintained, and in several places it had been reclaimed by the mountain in ways that required him to dismount and lead his mare on foot while he figured out what was under the snow and whether it would hold. The snow itself had started around mid-morning, light at first and then heavier, the kind of steady snowfall that didn't rage but accumulated with purpose. Ethan kept moving. He had ridden in worse. He told himself this with the regularity of a man repeating a useful truth, because the mind, when cold and tired, needed something concrete to hold on to. He had ridden in worse. He knew this terrain was passable because he had passed through it before. The snow was bad, but it was not impassable snow, and his mare was sure-footed and experienced. And the thing about difficult terrain was that you went through it one step at a time, and the sum of the steps was eventually the other side. The summit of the pass came at early afternoon, and the wind at the top was something else. A full cutting blast that came off the higher peaks with nothing to slow it, hitting at an angle that made his eyes water immediately and drove the snow horizontally into his face. He kept his head down and kept moving because stopping at the top of the pass was the wrong option by every metric. The descent was worse than the ascent in certain ways, the footing more uncertain, the grade steep enough that his mare had to pick each step carefully, and the snow on the downslope had a crust that broke unpredictably underfoot. He went down mostly on foot himself, leading her because his weight on her back on that grade in those conditions was asking too much. He was 2/3 down the descent when his mare's left foreleg went through the crust, and she lurched sideways, and he caught the fall partly with his own body, going down hard on his right side onto rock under the snow, and lay there for a second while he figured out whether anything was broken. His hip, he determined after a moment, was going to be magnificent shades of purple by tomorrow. Nothing else was structural damage. He got up, checked the mare, found her sound if shaken, and kept going. The rest of the descent was uneventful in the manner of things that are very difficult but don't add any new difficulties on top. He came out of the mountains in the late afternoon of the second day. Mercy Falls was another 12 miles across the lower valley. He rode those 12 miles in the dark with his hip aching and his coat frozen stiff at the shoulders and his mind doing the arithmetic of hours against the picture of Noah in that cot, feverish and small. He arrived in Mercy Falls at 11 at night, on a main street that was dark except for a saloon and a lamp burning in an upstairs window above a door that said Dr. Harlan Price, Medicine and Surgery. He knocked. The man who opened the door was in his 50s, in a nightshirt with a coat thrown over it, with the slightly disoriented look of someone pulled from sleep and the alert eyes of someone who has learned, over years of medical practice, that nighttime knocking is rarely about something small. He took in Ethan, the frozen coat, the bruised gait, the expression, and opened the door wider without asking who he was. "Come in," Dr. Price said. "Tell me what happened." "Yeah." Price read Cole's letter while Ethan ate the bread and cold meat the doctor produced with automatic hospitality, and his expression as he read was the focused, technical expression of a physician parsing clinical information. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at Ethan with a directness that Ethan appreciated. "This presentation you've described," Price said. "How many days since the relapse?" 2 days ago." "And how was his condition when you left?" "Deteriorating. The fever was climbing." Price nodded slowly. He didn't say anything reassuring, which Ethan also appreciated. He stood up and went to a cabinet and began moving things with the organized efficiency of a man who knew exactly where everything was. "The treatment I've been using is effective," Price said, not looking up from what he was doing. "I've seen it work in worse presentations than what Cole is describing, but it needs to be administered correctly, and it's sensitive to—" He paused. "It needs to arrive intact. I'm going to pack it carefully. I'm also going to write out the administration instructions in enough detail that your Dr. Cole won't have questions." "How long?" Ethan asked. "An hour. Maybe less." Price glanced back at him. "You're not in any condition to ride back tonight. I'll leave at first light." "You took the Sentinel track coming in?" "Yes." "In November." Price looked at him with the mildly incredulous expression of a sensible man contemplating an insensible action. "The boy must matter considerably." Ethan looked at the bread in his hands. "Yes," he said, "he does." Price held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once and went back to his work. "The pass will be more dangerous going back if the snow continues," he said. "There's a man in this town, Garrett, who guides through those mountains. First light, find him. Offer him whatever rate he names. I know the route. You know it well enough to get here half frozen with a bruised hip and alone, Price said calmly. A guide knows it well enough to keep you and the medicine intact on the return trip, which is the part that matters. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Where do I find Garrett? He asked. 2 doors down, blue door. He found Garrett, who named a rate that was ambitious and probably accounted for the hour and the season and the general insanity of the request. And Ethan agreed to it without negotiating because Price was right, and negotiating about it was not the relevant use of time. He slept 4 hours on a cot in Price's office and was saddled and ready before dawn. The return through the Sentinel was different with Garrett. Not easier exactly, because the conditions had deteriorated overnight and there was new snow at the higher elevations, but safer in the specific way that local knowledge makes things safer. Garrett knew which sections of the track had shifted under the new snow and which were stable. He knew where to push the pace and where to slow it to almost nothing. He moved through the mountain with the unhurried confidence of a man who has made peace with difficult terrain over decades, and following him felt like following something that knew the mountain rather than something fighting through it. They came over the pass in the midday and began the descent, and this time Ethan kept himself in the saddle because Garrett had found a line down the slope that didn't require leading the horses on foot, and they were off the serious grade by early afternoon and moving fast across the lower hills. Garrett left him in the edge of the Iron Hollow territory. This is your country now, Crow. You know the rest of it. And Ethan rode the last stretch alone, pushing his mare harder than was entirely fair now that the worst terrain was behind them, because the arithmetic of hours was pressing at him in a way it had been pressing since Mercy Falls, and he needed it to resolve. He rode into Iron Hollow in the late afternoon of the 3rd day, which was 1 day better than Cole's most optimistic estimate and 2 days better than his realistic one. He was barely in the street before Walt Pickett was moving toward him, and the young sheriff's face told him in the first second that things had gotten worse. How bad? Ethan asked. Walt's mouth tightened. The fever peaked last night. Doc Cole's been with him all day. Clara hasn't left the building since... He stopped. She's not sleeping. She won't eat. I tried to bring her food this morning, and she wouldn't even look at it. Ethan swung down from his mare. Every part of his body registered the last 3 days simultaneously and comprehensively. He handed the reins to the liveryman who had appeared at his elbow, took the carefully packed medicine case from his saddlebag, and walked toward the schoolhouse. Clara was in the doorway before he reached it. He didn't know if she'd heard the horse, or if someone had told her, or if she'd simply been watching the road. She was standing in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself, and she looked like what 3 days of not sleeping and barely eating looked like someone who had been holding something together through sheer will with nothing left in reserve. She saw him. She saw the case in his hand. He watched something in her face break open and then pull itself together again almost immediately. Not because she was suppressing it, but because that was just the way she was built, the instinct toward containment so deep it operated even when the emotion was relief. You made it, she said. Her voice was steady, barely. I made it, he said. Let's get Cole. He walked past her into the building. He heard her follow, her footsteps close behind his, and he was aware of her presence at his back with the same awareness he'd had of very few people in his life, the specific awareness of someone whose proximity registered as important. He had 3 days of mountain and cold and bad sleep behind him, and his hip was a disaster, and he needed to eat something and probably sleep for 12 hours. None of that was the first thing. The first thing was getting the medicine to Cole and Cole to Noah, and that was what he did, and he stood in the doorway of the back room and watched Cole read Price's instructions with the careful attention of a doctor who was going to get this right, and he breathed once, slowly, with the feeling of a man who has been holding something very tightly for 70 hours and is beginning, very carefully, to let go. Behind him, Clara put her hand on his arm. Not grabbing, not dramatic, just her hand, resting there, saying the things she wasn't saying out loud. He put his hand over hers, and they stood like that in the doorway, waiting. Cole administered the first dose that evening. Ethan sat outside in the hallway on a chair that was too small for him, which was becoming a recurring theme in this building, and listened to the sounds from the back room. Cole's quiet, professional instructions, the rustle of movement, Clara's voice asking a question in a low tone, and Cole answering it. Noah didn't make much sound. That was the part that was hard to sit with. A sick child who wasn't complaining was a child who didn't have the energy to complain, and that knowledge sat in Ethan's chest with a particular weight. Ida arrived at some point in the early evening with food, a covered pot of soup and a loaf of bread in the manner of a woman who had decided that feeding people was the appropriate response to crisis and was not going to be talked out of it. She set it on the teacher's desk in the main room, looked at Ethan, looked at the hallway, and said nothing, which was its own kind of kindness. "Eat something," she told him. "I will. Now, not later. You look like something the mountain chewed up and reconsidered." He ate. The soup was better than anything he'd had in 3 days, which wasn't a high bar but was still true, and he ate 2 bowls of it and most of the bread sitting at the desk in the schoolroom among the small chairs and the slate boards and the smell of chalk dust while the light outside went from gray to dark. Clara came out of the back room around 8 o'clock. She looked at the food, and then at him, and then she sat down and ate without saying anything, which told him she'd been running on essentially nothing for 3 days, and her body had overridden whatever argument her mind might have made about stopping to do this. They sat at opposite ends of the teacher's desk and ate soup in the quiet, and outside the wind moved through Iron Hollow with the business-like persistence of early winter. "Cole says the first 12 hours are the critical window," Clara said at some point. "I know, he told me. After that, if the fever responds..." She stopped. "He wouldn't tell me exactly what happens if it doesn't respond." "He told me that too," Ethan said. She looked at him. "What did he say?" Ethan considered the options. He'd watched her handle 3 days of the worst kind of not knowing with a steadiness that had cost her considerably, and he decided the honest answer was more respectful than a managed one. He said if the fever doesn't begin to drop within 12 hours, the odds change significantly. But he also said the treatment Price uses has worked in worse presentations than Noah's. Those 2 things are both true. Clara nodded. She'd put her spoon down and was looking at the table. "I keep thinking about the last 2 weeks," she said, "when he was getting better. He was so like himself, annoying and curious and talking too much and getting into things he shouldn't." Her voice caught slightly and she stopped. "He's going to do all of that again," Ethan said. "You don't know that." "No, but I think it anyway." She looked at him then, with something complicated in her face. Not quite a smile, not one. "That's not very scientific." "No," he agreed. The night settled in around them. Ethan stayed, not because anyone asked him to, but because leaving didn't occur to him as an option. He took the first watch outside Noah's door while Clara slept, or tried to sleep. On the cot she'd pulled into the main room, and he sat in the hallway in the dark and listened to Noah's breathing and Cole's occasional movement from inside. Around midnight, Cole came out. Ethan looked at him. "The fever is the same," Cole said quietly. "Not better, but not worse either." He paused. "I don't want to tell you this means something it doesn't mean, but it's not nothing." "Not worse is not nothing," Ethan said. "Exactly." The doctor sat down in the other chair. There were 2 chairs in the hallway now, which meant Clara had thought to put them there, probably before she'd started trying to sleep. Cole looked tired in the way that doctors look tired when they've been managing both the medical situation and the emotional weight of everyone around it. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "The Sentinel track. In 3 days. That was..." Cole seemed to be searching for the right word. "That was not a reasonable thing to do." "No," Ethan agreed. "Why did you do it?" Ethan looked at the closed door of the back room. "Because it needed to be done, and I could do it." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Is that the whole answer?" Ethan didn't say anything to that, which was itself an answer. Cole seemed to understand because he nodded once, slowly, in the manner of a man who has received the information he was actually looking for. "The boy is lucky to have someone like you in his corner," Cole said. He stood, with the careful movements of someone whose joints were registering the hour. "I'm going to check on him again. Try to sleep." "I'm fine." "You look terrible," Cole said, not unkindly, and went back into the room. Ethan sat in the hallway and didn't sleep. His hip ached. His shoulders ached. The cold of the mountain had gotten into his joints in the specific way that cold does when you've been in it for long enough. Not on the surface, but deeper, and it was working itself out slowly in the warmth of the building. He was tired in a way that went past physical. The kind of tired that happens when you've been holding something tightly for too long, and the holding itself has been the point. He was aware, sitting there in the dark hallway, of the precise shape of what he'd been refusing to look at for the past 6 weeks. He was in love with Clara Bennett. He'd known it for a while, in the indirect peripheral way that you can know things when you've decided not to look at them directly. He'd known it somewhere around the third supper at the table, probably, or maybe earlier. Maybe the moment she'd taken the $14 out of his hand in the dark outside the doctor's office. Not grateful in a showy way, but grateful in a real one, and looked at him like he was an actual person rather than a large inconvenience that had materialized with money. The problem was not the knowing. The problem was everything that the knowing connected to. He had been married once, 16 years ago. Her name had been Ruth, and she had been patient and funny and had understood what kind of man he was, in a way that he'd taken for granted at the time, the way you take for granted things that seem permanent until they aren't. She had died of a fever in their 3rd year of marriage, in a town not unlike Iron Hollow, and he had sat outside a room very much like this one and listened to her breathing change and slow and stop. He had left after that. Not immediately. He'd gone through the motions of a man with somewhere to be for a few months after, finishing out a contract he'd signed before everything changed. But somewhere in those months he had made a decision he'd never fully articulated even to himself, that the cost of having something was the eventual cost of losing it, and that the arithmetic of that was something he couldn't afford to run again. So he had moved. He had made himself into a man who moved, for whom no town was permanent and no face was irreplaceable, and no small room with a low candle was anything more than temporary shelter. He had been extremely good at this for 16 years. And now he was sitting in a hallway outside a room where a 9-year-old boy was fighting a fever, thinking about Ruth for the first time in years without the familiar reflex of moving his mind away from the thought. The difference, he thought, was that losing Ruth had been something that happened to him. This, whatever this was something he was choosing. He was choosing it one supper at a time, one conversation at a time, one firewood pile and one card game and one mountain crossing at a time. He had been choosing it without admitting he was choosing it, which was perhaps the most human thing he'd done in 16 years. Around 3 a.m, he heard Clara get up. She appeared in the hallway doorway wrapped in a blanket, her hair loose in the way it was only when she'd been sleeping and hadn't had time to pin it back. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You didn't sleep," she said. "No." "How is he?" "The same. Cole says not worse is something." She came and sat in the second chair, pulling the blanket around herself, and they sat in the hallway together in the dark. The building creaked in the wind. Down the street, something intermittent and wooden was knocking against something else. A loose sign, maybe, or a shutter that hadn't been latched. "Tell me something," Clara said. "What? Anything. I need to think about something else for 5 minutes." She paused. "Tell me about somewhere you've been. Somewhere that surprised you." He thought about it. "There's a valley about 200 miles north of here, Sat," he said. "High country, completely surrounded by mountains on 3 sides. You come over a pass and it's just there. A lake in the middle of it, so still it looks like metal. I came through it in early summer years ago, and there were wildflowers the whole length of it." He paused. "I remember thinking I'd never seen anything so completely itself. Like that valley hadn't been made for anything in particular. It was just there, being what it was." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Did you stay?" "Just one night." "Why?" He looked at the wall across from him. "I had somewhere to be." She heard the weight in that, he could tell. She didn't push it. "I used to think Iron Hollow was temporary too," she said. "When I first came. I thought I'd stay 2 years, save enough to move somewhere larger, somewhere with more, I don't know, more of whatever it was I thought I was missing." A pause. "And then the 2 years passed, and I kept finding reasons that this particular month wasn't the right time to leave. And then Noah got sick the first time, and then the second time. And I realized somewhere in there that temporary had become something else without my noticing. Utspoas. Honete. Does that bother you?" he asked. "Sometimes." She was honest about it without drama. "And sometimes I look at my students and think, these 12 children know more about what they're capable of because I was here. And that's not nothing either." She shifted in her chair. "It's not the life I imagined. but I'm not sure the one I imagined would have been better. Just different. Ethan sat with that. You're a good teacher, he said. It came out simpler than he'd intended, but simple was what he had. How would you know? You've never seen me teach. Noah, he said. She made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Noah is going to argue with his teachers until he's 90, she said. That's because his teacher taught him that questions were worth asking. She looked at him. In the dark hallway, with her hair loose and the blanket around her shoulders, she looked very much like herself. Not the composed schoolteacher version she wore during the day, but the actual person underneath it, tired and worried and still, somehow, possessed of a kind of steadiness that had nothing to do with everything being fine. Ethan, she said, yes. When Noah gets better, she stopped, started again. I know we haven't talked about what happens. After the judge comes and the case is closed. She was picking her words carefully, not looking at him. I don't want to have a conversation that creates an obligation you didn't ask for. That's not... Another stop. I just need to know if I should... She pressed her lips together. Should I stop? Whatever this is, should I stop doing it before it goes further? The hallway was very quiet. Ethan thought about all the versions of the answer he could give her. The cautious ones, the ones that protected him, the ones that were technically honest without being fully so. He thought about 16 years of moving and the very good reasons he'd had for all of it. No, he said, don't stop. She looked at him then, directly, and he held her gaze without looking away. I'm not good at this, he said. I want to be honest about that. I've spent a long time making sure I didn't have anything to be bad at, in this specific way, and I have things I'm still working out. He paused. But I'm not leaving because I want to leave. I want you to know that. Whatever happens, that's true. Clara held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, in the manner of someone who has received an honest answer and is choosing to receive it as what it is rather than what they might have wished for. Okay, she said quietly. They sat in the hallway for another hour, not talking much, occasionally checking on Noah through the cracked door, until Clara fell asleep in her chair with the blanket pulled to her chin and her head tipped sideways against the wall in a position that was going to hurt her neck in the morning. Ethan considered waking her and moving her to the cot and decided against it because she was actually sleeping, finally, and that mattered more than the logistics of it. He sat next to her in the dark and listened to Noah breathe, and the breathing over the course of that hour changed, so subtly at first that he wasn't sure, and then more clearly, steadying into something slower and less effortful. He went into the room. Cole was awake, sitting in the corner, and he looked up when Ethan entered. Ethan looked at Noah. The flush was different, lighter, and the way the boy's body lay, not rigid with the effort of fighting something but loose, actually resting, was different too. His temperature dropped, Cole said quietly. About 20 minutes ago. Just started. He paused. It's early. I don't want to... I know, Ethan said, but it's moving in the right direction. Ethan stood at the foot of the cot and looked at this boy he had ridden 3 days through mountains for, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been pulled tight since the afternoon Walt Pickett had come running across the freight yard. He went back to the hallway and sat down. Clara was still asleep. He didn't wake her. She would know soon enough, and sleep was what she needed, and he could hold this for another hour while she got it. That was the thing about caring about people, he thought. You spent a lot of time holding things for them, things they didn't know you were holding. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the version of love that appeared in the stories people told. It was just the work of it, quiet and unglamorous and ongoing. He was beginning to think that was the actual point. Chishichipu chishiti. Noah woke up mid-morning and he woke up hungry. This was, Cole said, as good a sign as he could have hoped for. The fever down to low grade, the color different, the boy's eyes clear in a way they hadn't been since the collapse. He ate a small amount of broth and then asked for bread and was told not yet, which caused him to lodge a formal protest with Clara, who received it with the expression of someone who was simultaneously trying not to cry and not to laugh. Ethan watched all of this from the doorway. You look terrible, Noah told him. You said that already, Ethan said, 2 months ago. I said you were big. This is different. This is a different observation. Noah considered him. Did you sleep at all? Some? You should sleep. I'll sleep when things are settled. They're settled, Noah said, with the simple authority of a 9-year-old who has decided a matter is closed. I'm awake and I'm hungry, and the bad part is over, so you should sleep. Ethan looked at Clara. He's not wrong, she said. He slept for 6 hours on the cot in the main room, which was too short for him and smelled like chalk and was probably the best sleep he'd had in 3 weeks. The circuit judge arrived on a Thursday, 4 days after Noah's fever broke. His name was Aldous Cram, and he was a lean, precise man in his 60s who handled the Bellamy case with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had processed a great many cases and had long since made peace with the fact that frontier justice was imperfect by nature. He heard testimony from Ethan, from Webb, from the Harpers, and 2 of the miners, and from Walt Pickett, who gave his account with a seriousness that suggested he'd been rehearsing. Bellamy entered a plea that was substantially less confident than the man Ethan had pulled from a tent in the hill country. The 6 weeks in Walt Pickett's jail had done something to the architecture of his certainty. He was bound over for trial at the territorial court in the spring, which meant he would spend the winter in the county jail, which was larger and better guarded than Iron Hollow's. Ethan gave his testimony, signed his paperwork, and collected the warrant fee. He stood outside the courthouse afterward with the closed case in his hands, not literally, but the feeling of it, and looked down the main street of Iron Hollow and thought about what happened next. 2 days later, he went to see Clara, not at the schoolhouse. School was in session, and he had learned by now to respect the boundary of that. He waited until the afternoon, when she walked back along the main street after dismissing her students, and he fell into step beside her the way they'd fallen into a dozen small routines over the weeks. "The case is closed," he said. "I heard," she said. She was carrying a stack of papers that needed marking. Her hair had a piece of chalk in it that she was apparently unaware of. "I've been thinking," he said. "That sounds ominous." "It might be." He put his hands in his coat pockets. The weather had turned properly cold now, the kind that said winter was not approaching, but arrived. "There's no marshal assigned to this district. Walt Pickett is good, but he's young and he's alone, and with the spring trial coming up, and Bellamy's people still somewhere in the hills." "Ethan," her voice was careful. "There's a deputy marshal position," he said, "attached to this circuit. I talked to Cram about it." She stopped walking. He stopped with her. "A deputy marshal position," she repeated, "based here, covering this district." He looked at her. "Cram said the appointment would take about 3 weeks to formalize. He seemed to think I was suited for it." Clara looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone who is processing several things simultaneously and is taking care not to get ahead of themselves. "That's not—" "You'd be staying," she said. "I'd be staying. Not just passing through." "Not just passing through," he agreed. "Because of the job," she said, and it was both a question and not one. "Partly," he said. He held her gaze. "Not entirely." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at the stack of papers in her arms, which was perhaps her version of the thing he did when he needed somewhere to put his eyes that wasn't the center of a difficult conversation. "I told you I wasn't good at this," he said. "I meant it. I'm going to be difficult sometimes about things that probably shouldn't be difficult. I have habits that are—" He paused. "I've been a particular kind of man for a long time." "I know," Clara said. "I've been watching. And I think you're a different kind of man than you think you are," she said. "I think the one you've been being is the one you made on purpose after something happened. And I think—" She stopped. "I think the one underneath it is the one who rode 3 days through a mountain pass in November for a child who isn't his." He was quiet. "I'm not asking you to be something you're not," she said. "I never was. I'm just—" She shifted the papers. "I'd like you to stay, for whatever that's worth." "It's worth quite a bit," he said. A small silence. "The chalk," he said. "In your hair." She put a hand up automatically, found it, pulled it out, looked at it, and then she laughed, genuine and slightly surprised by itself, the laugh of someone who had been very serious for a very long time and found the lightness of the small moment unexpectedly available. It was the best thing he'd heard in months. He told Noah that evening. The boy was sitting up in his cot. The cot had migrated back to the back room now that he was well enough to be moved. with a book open in his lap that he was pretending to read but was clearly not reading, because when Ethan appeared in the doorway, his attention relocated from the page to Ethan with a speed that confirmed the reading had been approximate. "I'm staying," Ethan said. Noah looked at him. His expression went through something. Not surprise, interestingly. More like the face of someone who had been hoping for a thing and is now watching the hope become real and isn't entirely sure yet that it's safe to let it land. Staying, he said? Or staying like last time where you came back?" Staying, Ethan said. "Deputy Marshal, this district." Noah absorbed this. "Does Clara know?" "She knows." "What did she say?" "She said she'd like me to stay." Noah nodded with the seriousness of a boy processing information that mattered. "She doesn't say things like that to people," he said. "Usually." "I know." "She said it to you." "She did." Another nod. Then, quietly, "I'm glad you went to get the medicine." "Me too," Ethan said. "Even though it was dangerous?" "Even though." Noah looked at his book, looked at Ethan. "I knew you'd come back," he said. "I told Clara you would, but she said she didn't want to count on it because she didn't want to be—" He seemed to reconsider. "She was scared. She didn't say that, but I could tell." "I know," Ethan said. "She gets scared about people leaving," Noah said, with the matter-of-fact accuracy of a child reporting a fact about weather. "Because they usually do." He looked at Ethan with eyes that were both young and not. "You're not going to do that." It wasn't entirely a question. "No," Ethan said. "I'm not." Noah seemed to settle at that. A physical shift, something releasing in his small frame. He pulled his book back into his lap and turned a page. "You can sit down if you want," he said, in the tone of someone issuing a casual invitation they considered self-evident. Ethan sat. They were in that position. Ethan in the chair, Noah with his book, the lamp between them making the room warm against the cold outside. When Clara appeared with 2 cups of coffee and looked at them both with an expression that she quickly arranged into something more neutral, but not before Ethan had seen it. The face of someone recognizing something they'd been missing without knowing they'd been missing it. She handed him one of the cups and sat on the edge of Noah's cot and asked the boy how far he'd gotten in the book. And Noah launched into a detailed summary that suggested he'd been paying more attention to the reading than he'd let on, and the conversation went the way their evenings went. Practical and warm and slightly argumentative in the specific way of people who are genuinely comfortable with each other. Outside, the wind came off the mountains in the dark and moved through the town and kept going. Inside the 2 rooms behind the schoolhouse, the lamp burned steadily. Ethan drank his coffee and led himself, carefully, with the specific deliberateness of a man dismantling a habit he'd maintained for 16 years. Want the thing that was in front of him. It was harder than the Sentinel track. It was harder than most things he'd done. He did it anyway. The deputy marshal appointment came through on a Tuesday in early December, which meant Ethan Crow was officially a lawman for the first time in his life. On a day when the temperature dropped to single digits, and the main street of Iron Hollow was a sheet of ice that had already taken down 2 horses and 1 elderly citizen who had walked out of the general store without adequate attention to his footing. Walt Pickett shook his hand with the enthusiasm of a man who was genuinely glad to no longer be the only person responsible for keeping order in the district. "I'll show you where we keep everything," Walt said, which turned out to be a short tour because everything was in the jail, and the jail was not a large building. "I've seen jails before," Ethan said. "Right," Walt said. "Of course." He paused. "I'm glad you're staying." "I know," Ethan said. "Go check on the Harper Road. There were tracks north of the ridge yesterday that I don't like." Walt went. Ethan pinned his badge to his coat and looked at it for a moment. A flat piece of stamped tin that didn't weigh anything to speak of, which was strange given what it changed. He was not a man who had ever been particularly interested in symbols, but the badge meant he had stopped moving, officially, and that was its own kind of weight, regardless of what it was made of. He walked to the schoolhouse. The door was open in the way it was during the school day, the sound of Claire's voice carrying into the cold air as he approached. She was doing something with numbers, and one of the older students was clearly resistant to the underlying logic of the problem, and she was walking him through it with the particular patience of someone who has explained a thing many times, and has found the patience not by suppressing frustration, but by genuinely believing the student will get there. Think about it like a fence line, she was saying. If you have a property that's 40 acres and you sell off 8, you don't need to know what 40 minus 8 is in the abstract. You need to know how much fence to pull down. Now, how much fence does Marcus Webb pull down? A pause, then a boy's voice, tentative. 32? 32, Clara confirmed. Not effusively, not with the performance of a teacher rewarding a correct answer, but with the matter-of-fact satisfaction of someone who had waited for the right moment and found it. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment without going in. He had watched her work before, in fragments, but there was something about today, maybe the badge on his coat, the officiousness of the appointment, that made him look at it differently. She was doing something that mattered. Quietly, without anyone making a particular fuss about it, she was building the interior lives of 12 children in a frontier town who would carry what she taught them for the rest of their lives. They'd do it without thinking about her, most of them, the way people use things they've genuinely learned, automatically, as part of themselves, the origin forgotten. He thought that probably didn't bother her. He thought she'd made peace with that specific invisibility a long time ago, because she was the kind of person whose reasons for doing things were located somewhere that didn't require an audience. He left without going in. He'd see her tonight. Winter settled on Iron Hollow with the blunt efficiency of a season that had a job to do. The passes closed. The traffic through town reduced to the essential kind. Freight that couldn't wait. Travelers who had misjudged their timing. The occasional rancher riding in for supplies with the look of someone who would rather be home but had run out of something important. Ethan's work changed in winter. There was less of the tracking and apprehending that had defined his professional life for 16 years and more of the slower, less dramatic work of keeping a community functional under hard conditions. He checked on the families on the East Road after heavy snowfalls. He handled a dispute between two ranchers over a water source that had been contentious since before he'd arrived, and that he resolved not through any legal mechanism, but by riding out to the water source himself, looking at it, and explaining to both parties that the source was feeding from a point uphill of both their properties, and that the sensible thing was a shared management arrangement, which they eventually agreed to with the grudging air of men who had wanted to stay angry but had run out of logical justification. That's not lawman work, Walt pointed out. It is if the alternative is one of them shooting the other, Ethan said. Walt considered this. Fair, he said. He was learning the district the way he'd learned territories his whole career, by writing them, by talking to people, by building a map in his head that was less about geography and more about the web of relationships and tensions and histories that made a place what it actually was beneath its visible surface. Iron Hollow was more complicated than it looked from the outside, which was true of most places. There was an old feud between two families over a land claim from 15 years ago that everyone was politely pretending wasn't still active. There was a woman on the South Road who was being quietly threatened by a creditor in a way that was probably illegal and definitely predatory. There was a mine operation north of town that was underpaying its workers in ways that would eventually produce a confrontation, and the question was whether someone intervened intelligently now or dealt with the consequences of no one intervening later. He handled the creditor situation first because that was the most urgent. He rode to the man's office, a loan operation in the next town over, 20 miles east, and had a conversation that was polite on the surface and very clear underneath, and the woman on the South Road stopped receiving threatening letters shortly thereafter. "How did you do that?" Clara asked when she heard. "I explained the relevant statutes," Ethan said, "and the personal consequences of ignoring them. Did you threaten him?" "Legally," Ethan said. Clara gave him a look that suggested she understood exactly what legally meant in this context, and was choosing not to examine it too carefully, which he appreciated. The mine situation took longer and was resolved through a conversation with the operation's owner that required Ethan to be considerably more patient than he felt, because the owner was the kind of man who confused stubbornness with principle and needed to be walked around to the right conclusion through a door that felt like his own idea. But it resolved. The wages adjusted. The foreman, who'd been quietly documenting the discrepancies for months, shook Ethan's hand with the firm grip of someone who'd been waiting a long time for this particular conversation to happen. None of it was glamorous. None of it was the kind of work that generated stories. It was just the ongoing, unspectacular business of keeping a community from grinding against itself in ways that caused permanent damage. He found, to his own surprise, that he was good at it, not in the way he'd been good at tracking people. That was a skill built from distance and detachment. This was different. This required being present. It required caring about outcomes in ways that outlasted his personal involvement in them. He'd spent 16 years perfecting the art of completing things and moving on, and now he was learning that some things weren't meant to be completed. They were meant to be tended. He was 41 years old. He thought it was probably not too late to learn that. He asked Clara to marry him in February. This is not as simple a sentence as it sounds, because the asking of it was preceded by approximately 6 weeks of Ethan understanding that he wanted to ask it, and being unable to locate the right moment, which was partly genuine difficulty in finding the moment, and partly the deep-seated instinct of a man who had spent 16 years avoiding exactly this kind of permanence. The moment he finally found, or that found him, was not elegant. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Clara was at the kitchen table with a stack of books she was preparing for the following week's lessons, and Ethan was fixing the latch on the back door that had been loose since October and that he kept meaning to get to and kept not getting to. And Noah was somewhere in the building making the particular kind of intermittent thumping noise that suggested he was engaged in an activity that would result in something needing to be cleaned up. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Ethan said. Clara said, not looking up from her book. "Clara." Something in his voice made her look up. He had put down his tools. He was standing in the doorway with the winter light behind him and the loose latch in his hand because he'd been holding it when he started talking and hadn't thought to put it down. "I want to stay," he said. I'm not just talking about the appointment. I want to stay the way people stay when they've decided, permanently." He paused. "I want to marry you." Clara looked at him. He waited. "You're holding a door latch," she said. "I know. You planned this moment and included a door latch." "I didn't exactly plan." "Ethan?" She stood up. She was smiling, which was the thing he'd been hoping for, and also the thing that made it hardest to maintain his composure, because her smile was rare enough that it still caught him slightly off guard when it arrived. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." From somewhere in the back of the building, Noah's voice. "Did he ask?" "Were you listening?" Clara called. "I was nearby." "That's the same as listening." "Did he ask, though?" "Yes," Clara said. A pause. Then, with great satisfaction, "I told you he would." They married in April, when the passes opened and the world thawed back into itself with the messy, muddy enthusiasm of a frontier spring. The ceremony was held at the schoolhouse, the largest available space, and also, as Clara pointed out, the most appropriate venue for the woman who had spent 3 years making it the center of her life. Judge Cram, who was in town for the spring session and had developed a fond exasperation with Ethan over the winter's legal correspondence, performed the ceremony. He was brief and dry and managed to say the essential things without any of the elaborate ornamentation that Ethan would have found excruciating. Clara wore a dress that Ida had helped her with, deep blue, which was not traditional, but was the color she'd chosen and defended calmly against Ida's mild suggestion that ivory was more customary. "It's my wedding," Claire had said. "It is," Ida had agreed, and that had been that. Most of Iron Hollow came. This was partly because Iron Hollow was a small town and weddings were significant community events, and partly because the people of that town had spent the winter watching Ethan Crow move through their lives, fixing fences and resolving disputes and riding out in bad weather to check on people who hadn't been seen and handling the creditor situation, which had spread by retelling into something larger than the actual event, and had formed opinions about him that they wanted to express through attendance. Marcus Webb stood in the back with the expression of a man who was moved and intended to deny it if asked. Walt Pickett cried, which he was embarrassed about and which Noah found enormously entertaining. Noah himself stood at the front in a clean shirt that he'd put on without being told, which Clara said afterward was the most surprising part of the entire day. And he watched the proceedings with the serious attention of someone marking an occasion he understood mattered. When it was done, he grabbed both of them in the same kind of full-contact embrace he'd used on Ethan outside Dr. Cole's office months before, and this time Ethan put both arms around him and held on properly. Which was the right thing, and he knew it. "We're a family now," Noah said, into the general vicinity of Ethan's shoulder. "We've been a family," Ethan said, "since before this." Noah pulled back and looked at him with the evaluating eyes of someone checking an answer. "Since when?" Ethan thought about it. "Since the matchsticks," he said. Noah grinned, the full, unguarded grin of a boy who was deeply pleased with how things had turned out. "I let you win that last hand," he said. "You absolutely did not." "I did. I'm very good at cards." "You're 9 years old." 10, Noah corrected with dignity. "As of last month." Ethan looked at Clara, who was watching this exchange with the expression she'd been wearing for most of the day. Not quite a smile. Something fuller than that. The face of someone standing inside a life they'd worked for and finding it, in this particular moment, fully real. The Bellamy trial happened in May at the territorial court, and Ethan rode the 2 days to testify and rode back with the news that Bellamy had been convicted on 4 counts and sentenced to 8 years at the territorial prison. He told Walt first, then Clara, then Webb, and Webb opened a bottle of whiskey that he'd apparently been saving for something and poured 4 glasses without counting who was receiving them. "Is it over?" Walt asked. "Legally," Ethan said. The outfit scattered. A few of the men turned up on other warrants in other districts over the winter. "There's 2 I haven't located yet." He paused. "It's over enough." That was the honest answer, he'd learned. Things were rarely completely over. They were over enough, and then you maintained the over-enoughness through ongoing attention, and that was the actual nature of safety. Not a state you achieved, but a condition you sustained through daily, unglamorous effort. That was true of more things than law enforcement, he thought. Much. It was in late August that the situation he'd been half expecting arrived. His name was Roy Decker, and he rode into Iron Hollow on a Saturday morning with 3 men and the deliberate visibility of someone who wanted to be noticed. Ethan had been at the freight yard when he arrived, and he heard about it within 20 minutes through the efficient communication network of a small town, which was basically just people walking to where he was and telling him. Decker had been one of Bellamy's men, not one of the 3 who'd been disarmed at the camp, one of the ones who'd ridden away that morning and disappeared into the territory. He was wanted on a lesser charge than Bellamy himself, but he was wanted, and more relevantly, he had apparently spent the past 9 months developing a grievance about the fact that Cord Bellamy was in a territorial prison, and the man responsible for that outcome was now living in Iron Hollow wearing a deputy marshal's badge. This was the kind of information that arrived with a weight to it. Ethan went home first. Clara was in the kitchen, and she looked at his face when he came in and said, "What happened?" "Decker's in town," he said. "One of Bellamy's men." She was quiet for a moment. "How many?" 4, counting him. She processed this in the careful way she processed difficult things, not panicking, not pretending it was smaller than it was. "Noah's at the Harper farm," she said. "He was going to ride back this afternoon. I'll send Walt to get him." She nodded. "What are you going to do?" He looked at her steadily. "My job," he said. "Ethan?" She crossed the room. She put both hands flat against his chest, not grabbing, not holding him back, just her hands on him, the way she did sometimes when she needed the contact to say the thing that words weren't quite sufficient for. "Be careful." "Always," he said. "You're not always," she said, "but be careful today." He covered her hands with his for a moment, then he put on his coat and went to find Decker. He found him at the Copper Nail, which was where Ethan had found most of the relevant things in his life in Iron Hollow, and he thought briefly about the circularity of that. The same low ceiling and the same rough whiskey, and Decker was at the bar with 2 of his men, and the bar had the particular quality of a space that was holding its breath. Ethan walked in, and every conversation in the room stopped. He walked to the bar, stood next to Decker. Not across from him, not confrontationally, next to him, in the way of a man who has decided that what's about to happen doesn't require theater. "Roy Decker," he said. Decker looked at him sidelong. He was a compact, weathered man in his 40s with the face of someone who had spent a long time angry about something and had let the anger do permanent work on his features. "Crow," he said. He said the name the way certain men said things, with extra weight, implying a history of thinking about it. "There's a warrant for you in 2 counties, Ethan said. Assault, property destruction, conspiracy to extort." He paused. Nothing capital, nothing that's going to put you away for longer than 3 years if you lawyer up properly. Decker looked at his glass. You took Bellamy down, he said. He was breaking the law, Ethan said. Same law you've been breaking. He paid my wage for 4 years. I understand that. Ethan kept his voice level. It doesn't change what the warrant says. Decker was quiet for a moment. His two companions at the bar were very still, with the particular stillness of men who were waiting to see how this resolved before deciding what their role in it was. And if I don't come quiet, Decker said, then it gets complicated, Ethan said. For everyone. Your men, the people in this room, you. He paused. I'm not interested in complicated. I don't think you are either, if you think about it clearly. Decker looked at him then, actually looked at him, and Ethan held his gaze without any particular tension in it, not aggressive, not backing down, just present. He'd been in enough confrontations to know that the ones where someone needed to prove something were different from the ones where they didn't, and this one was on the edge, and which way it fell depended on the next 30 seconds. You're not going to shoot me, Decker said. It wasn't quite a question. Not if I don't have to, Ethan said. That's the truth. I've killed men who needed killing, and I don't lose sleep over it. But you're not a man who needs killing, Decker. You're a man who made some poor choices working for someone who pointed you in bad directions. There's a difference between those two things. Something moved in Decker's face, small and not dramatic, but there. 3 years? He said. Maybe less if the testimony goes right, Ethan said. Bellamy took the main weight of it. You were an employee, not a principal. There's room to work with. Decker looked at his glass again, picked it up, finished the whiskey in it, set it down with the careful, deliberate movement of a man making a decision. I'm not drawing on a lawman, Decker said. Not for Bellamy. He wouldn't have done the same. I know, Ethan said. He brought Decker and his 3 men in without further incident. 2 of them were wanted on lesser warrants of their own and went quietly, with the resigned air of men who had known this was where things were heading. The third had nothing outstanding against him, and Ethan let him go, which surprised the man enough that he stood in the street for a full minute looking uncertain before he rode out. Walt locked Decker in and looked at Ethan with the expression he'd been developing over the winter. A combination of relief and the slowly building confidence of a young lawman watching someone with more experience make decisions and filing the method away. How did you know he'd come quiet? Walt asked. I didn't, Ethan said. I thought he would. There's a difference. What if you'd been wrong? Ethan thought about it honestly. Then it would have gone differently, he said. But I found that most men, when you give them a door that isn't humiliating to walk through, will walk through it. He paused. Not all of them, but most. Walt nodded, slowly, turning this over. Does it bother you? Walt asked. Not, when you don't have to, He was working toward the question he actually wanted to ask. Bellamy's men are the ones who hurt people here. Does it bother you that they don't pay more? Ethan said. Yeah. Sometimes, Ethan said. He was honest about it. But the law's not about satisfaction. It's about proportion. You give people more than proportion, and you end up with something that isn't the law anymore. He looked at the jail. That's a harder thing to rebuild than a fence. Claire was waiting on the porch when he got home. She didn't ask how it went. She could read the answer from the way he walked. She handed him a cup of coffee when he came up the steps, and he took it and stood beside her looking at the main street of Iron Hollow in the evening light. Noah's home? He asked. In his room, deeply unimpressed that he missed the excitement. He's 11. He's always going to want to see the excitement. I know. It's very inconvenient. She leaned against the post. You didn't shoot anyone. No. You could have. From what Walt told me, you could have justified it. I know. She was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you? He thought about it carefully because it was the kind of question that deserved a careful answer. Because the version of this where Decker walks into a jail cell is better than the version where he doesn't. Better for Decker, better for the people in that saloon, better for this town. He held the cup. And because I'm not the man I was when I came here. That man would have handled it differently, and the handling would have been technically defensible, but he stopped. I don't want to be technically defensible anymore. I want to be actually right. Clara looked at him with the steady, seeing look that he had learned over the months was how she showed that she was paying full attention, not performing attention, not being polite, but actually there. "That's new," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She took his free hand and held it, not saying anything else, and they stood on the porch while the evening came down on Iron Hollow, and the lamps came on one by one along the main street. The years that followed were not perfect. He wants to be clear about that. Whoever tells this story needs to be clear about it, because the version where everything resolves into smoothness is not what happened and is not, honestly, the useful version. Ethan was difficult about things sometimes. He had a temper that he managed better than he once had, but that still emerged when he was tired or frustrated in ways that required apology afterward. He had a tendency to go quiet when he was working something out that Clara had to learn to read as a process rather than a withdrawal, and learning it had taken time and some difficult conversations. There were nights when the old instinct woke up in him, the one that said that caring about people was the most dangerous thing you could do. And on those nights, he'd get up and sit on the porch in the dark and work through it the way you work through anything, one breath at a time, one reason at a time, until the morning came. Clara was not easy either. She was stubborn in the way that capable people who've handled everything alone for too long are stubborn. Sometimes she'd carry things further than she needed to before asking for help. And sometimes her self-sufficiency was a form of armor that he had to learn to see around rather than through. She had worries she kept to herself until they became larger than they needed to be. She had standards she held herself to that were, on occasion, unreasonably high. And on those occasions, she needed to hear from someone she trusted that she was being unreasonably hard on herself, and she needed to hear it more than once before it landed. They built their life with all of that in it. The difficulties were part of the materials, not obstacles to the construction. Noah grew into exactly the person he'd been becoming when Ethan arrived. Curious and argumentative and deeply loyal, with an instinct for the justice of things that surprised people until they remembered who'd raised him and who he'd spent his formative years watching work. He was 17 when he told Ethan he wanted to study law, and Ethan had looked at him for a long moment with the particular feeling of someone watching a thing complete its arc. "You'll be a good lawyer," Ethan said. "I'm going to be a great lawyer," Noah said. "Don't oversell yourself before you've passed the bar." "You're not even a little bit modest," Noah said. "You know exactly how good you are at what you do, and you're not modest about it internally. You're just quiet about it externally." Ethan looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I've been watching you for 8 years, Noah said. "I've been taking notes." He was right. Ethan didn't argue the point. The two children who came after Noah, a girl they named May and a boy named James, grew up in the rooms behind the schoolhouse and then in the larger house that Ethan built the year after May was born, on the east end of town where the lot had been vacant since before Ethan had arrived, and that he'd had his eye on since the second month. The building took most of a winter to complete, and it was not a beautiful house by the standards of people who'd seen beautiful houses, but it was solid, and it was built correctly, and it held together against the winters in a way that mattered more than beauty. Clara kept teaching. This was never a question. She kept teaching, and her roster grew as Iron Hollow grew. Slowly, imperfectly, with the 2 steps forward quality of places that are becoming something without fully knowing what they're becoming yet. And she was teaching the children of the students she'd taught in her first years by the time the decade turned. What she built in that schoolhouse was harder to see than what Ethan built with timber and nails, but it was the same kind of thing, something that held people, something built to last. The summer May turns 12. There was a morning when Ethan came out onto the porch early, before the family was up, and sat with his coffee in the way he'd sat on Mrs. Holt's porch 16 years before, looking at the street of Iron Hollow in the gray light before the day started. The town had changed, not enormously, but enough. A second eating establishment, which Ida pretended not to notice because she was loyal to the position of only competent establishment in town, and the new place was admittedly better at pie. A proper doctor's office for Dr. Cole, who had finally retired and been replaced by a woman from the East named Dr. Petra Walsh, who was 30 years old and brisk and better than Cole had been, which Cole acknowledged with the good-natured defeat of a man who respected competence above personal vanity. A school building that was now 2 rooms, because Clara's roster had gotten too large for one. Walt Pickett was a full marshal now, covering 2 districts, and the young man who'd come to Iron Hollow to be his deputy was 22 and terrified. And Ethan met with him twice a week the way someone had never met with Ethan when he was starting out, which he thought about sometimes without bitterness. Just the awareness that the thing you didn't get you could choose to give, and that was its own kind of correction. He sat on the porch with his coffee and thought about the man who had ridden into this town on a lame horse at nightfall with nothing to accomplish except collecting $40 and leaving before dawn. He thought about how close he'd come to doing exactly that, to taking the money and riding out and never knowing what he'd ridden away from. He thought about Ruth, too, which he could do now with sadness, but without the old flinching reflex. She had been real, and she had mattered, and losing her had broken something in him that had taken years and one particular small town to put back into a shape that worked. He did not think the breaking had been meaningless. He thought sometimes that the man who had arrived in Iron Hollow, the specific version of Ethan Crow who had been built from all of it, the war and the loss, and the 16 years of moving, was the version capable of recognizing what he'd found here, that an easier life might have produced a man too comfortable to know what he was looking at. He didn't know if that was true. He thought it might be a story he told himself to make the hard parts meaningful, and he thought that might be fine. That might be what people did. They told themselves the stories that let them carry the weight of what they'd been through, and if the story was honest about the actual weight, it was probably doing its job. The door opened behind him. Clara came out, wrapped in a coat, with her own cup of coffee, and she sat in the other chair the way she'd sat in chairs next to him, in hallways and at tables and on porches over 16 years, and she looked at the main street of Iron Hollow in the morning light. They sat there for a while without talking. "May's going to ask to ride to the Harper place today," Clara said eventually. "I know. Young Tom Harper is 15, Ethan said. "Yes." A pause. "She's 12. "I know that too." Another pause. "She's going to argue about it." "She is," Ethan agreed. "She's very good at arguing. I wonder where she got that." Clara looked at him with the expression that was the direct descendant of the expression she'd given him in the schoolroom all those years ago, when he'd been sitting in a child's chair and she'd been declining to be told what to do, the look that was both exasperated and privately amused. "She got it from both of us," Clara said. "Probably," Ethan said. The street below them was beginning to wake up. A horse went past with a rider heading for the North Road. Ida appeared at the door of her establishment and looked at the sky and went back inside to reach conclusions about the day. Down the street, at the jail, the deputy's lamp was on because the young man had learned early that the hours before the rest of the town was awake were the hours when you got things done. Clara reached over and took his hand. She did this sometimes in the mornings, not as statement, not as performance, just as the easy gesture of someone who had long ago run out of self-consciousness about wanting the contact. He held her hand and looked at the town. Here is what he had learned in the accumulation of years and seasons and difficult conversations and mornings on this porch. That strength was not the absence of need, that a man who needed nothing had nothing to build toward, that the courage it took to want something, to want it openly, to stake yourself to it, to let it matter enough that losing it would cost you, was the hardest kind of courage, and also the only kind that built anything worth keeping. He had been afraid of exactly this, the specific weight of it, the vulnerability of saying here is the thing I cannot afford to lose, and meaning it, and knowing the world was under no obligation to guarantee the keeping of it. He was still, in some quiet corner of himself, afraid of it. He thought he probably always would be. He thought that might be the right relationship to have with the things that mattered most. Not fearless possession, but clear-eyed love that knew what it had and knew what it risked and stayed anyway. Not because the alternative was death or disaster, but because some things were worth the full weight of caring about them, and half a life at a distance was no kind of life at all. The morning came on in full. The town went about its business. Inside the house, he heard the particular kind of thumping that meant children getting up, and then Noah's voice. He was home for the summer from his studies, telling someone to stop doing something, and May's answering voice explaining why the thing in question was not unreasonable, and James at 6 years old contributing to the argument with the single-minded energy of someone who was too young to follow the logic but was extremely committed to the volume. Clara squeezed his hand once. He squeezed back. "Ready?" she said. "For what?" She gestured briefly at the house behind them. The noise and the morning and the specific, complicated, imperfect life inside it. Yeah, Ethan Crow said. I am. He stood up and opened the door and went inside.